start, I guess. So to continue our discussion of these topological materials, today I'm going to speak about this superconductors, and for the reason that topology here allows for a special class of states called Majorana bound state. The word Majorana comes here because these, in certain sense, are analogous to high energy particles, which were discovered by Ettore Majorana a long time back. However, there is a distinction, and I would like to make that clear right in the beginning of the talks. So Majorana particles in high energy physics are fermions, and they can live in arbitrary dimensions, well, at least in 3 dimensions. However, here, these are rather better classified in condensed matter as Majorana modes, where they, first of all, are not fermions. In fact, they have non-abelian statistics, as I'm going to try to show you. And the second thing is that these are low energy stuff, low dimensional stuff, okay, and can exist at very special or zero energies. So with this distinction, let me try to sort of tell you a little bit about, oops, my screen, just 1 second. Yeah, so let me try to tell you a little bit about history of this thing, how this Majorana modes came about, and this is intimately connected to something called fermion number fractionalization. And then I'm going to go step by step, okay, and try to tell you and mostly concentrate on what are the measurement techniques of this Majorana fermions. Okay, so fractionalization in field theory. So much before quantum Hall effect came in 1976, Roman Jakiv and Charles Rebbe, I think they wrote a very interesting paper where they showed that there could be number or charge fluctuation in a 1+1 dimensional coupled field theory of fermions and bosons. So what they did is to consider a very simple Lagrangian. Okay, you can think of this as Hamiltonians, but for people who are more into condensed matter, but these are just the action counterpart of a Hamiltonian. Let me just put it that way. But we all are familiar with Lagrangians, right? So the thing is that, so what they did is to write down a Lagrangian in the bosonic sector for some field phi. So it is typically a Klein-Gordon stuff with some mass. Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay, I don't really know what's happening with this. Okay. Yeah. So it's typically this Klein-Gordon stuff with some mass term here. Okay, phi square minus 1 whole square. So that has the mass, and it also gives you an interacting phi-4 theory in some sense. And then they wrote a fermionic part, which of course is a Dirac-like theory in 1+1 dimension, but it is coupled to these bosons by this mass term, okay, m times phi. So the bosonic field appears in the fermionic Lagrangian. It's a psi bar phi psi coupling. Okay, and m is the mass parameter of these fermions. So they wanted to solve for this theory. Okay, so how do you do this? So first you see that the bosonic part doesn't have fermions, so that must be the easy part. Okay, because it just depends on the bosonic field. So you functionally differentiate this Lagrangian with respect to the field phi, and you get some equation of motion. So this equation of motion is your so this part is just like the Klein-Gordon theory. Okay, it's just some box acting on this phi. Okay, del square del t square minus grad square, and then from here, oops, sorry again. Then from this part, you get, because you have a phi square minus 1 whole square, you get a phi cube minus phi. Okay, so it's really simple. So this part just comes from this del L del phi equal to 0. Okay. So there are 2 solutions of this problem. Okay, the first one is called a vacuum sector solution, where this phi is just a constant. Okay, that's the simplest solution to this differential equation, and they call it the vacuum sector because there is no dynamics, and everything is just a standard constant, no spatial dependence, no dynamics, everything is just uniform ground state stuff. However, there is also another solution okay, which is again a time independent solution, which tells you that phi x could be tan h. Okay, so this tan h function, is also a solution to this, and the reason this happens is that you see that when you do this grad square on tan h, you get a functional form which just cancels this phi minus phi cube. Okay, so this is a standard soliton sector solution. Now the point is that once you have this soliton or kink cannot spontaneously decay into a vacuum sector. Okay, you cannot unwind it just like that. And in this sense, it's reminiscent of vortices in higher dimension. But of course, there could be kinks and anti-kinks corresponding to this plus tan hx and minus tan hx, these two solutions, which can annihilate each other. Okay, so these sectors are distinct. That's the point. So now,
Krishnendu, may I ask a quick question? So in this
yes,
soliton, when you say that things don't annihilate, it means that if I start with this as the initial state, it can sort of propagate again without shape change or something, or it's stationary. This is stationary, no?
So these are stationary, okay?
Okay.
So the point is that what I'm saying is that once you start with a state in this sector, where there is this kink, you cannot, without doing, so you can, just like a vortex, you cannot spontaneously go to the vacuum sector from here.
Okay.
You can think of it like a knot. Once the knot is there, unless you destabilize it somehow, you cannot really get us, you cannot unknot the system. That's the point. Okay. So now, the next thing they did is to look at the fate of the fermions, taking this solution for the bosonic sector. So first, in the vacuum sector, where the fermions are just, phi is just 1, the Lagrangian of the fermions is just this LF, okay? And this leads to standard Dirac equations in 1D, okay? So you just solve for this. This M is the mass parameter of the theory. Remember your beta mc square in Dirac equation, so it's just that. And you have standard Dirac gapped Dirac theory, where M provides the mass gap, okay? So now, what I would like to point out here, in any of this Dirac theory, be it in one dimension or otherwise, there is a scheme for counting number of fermions in the theory. The scheme is the following. So you basically fix your energy to some positive energy, let's say some E of k. Then you count the number, okay, of modes out there. So if that sector is occupied, you count a 1. And then, sorry, it doesn't have to be occupied. What I mean is that for corresponding that, you count a mode, which is 1. And then you double it, because you know corresponding to every EK, there is a negative energy, which is sitting below your mass gap. Okay. So everything goes in units of 2. Okay. So, and therefore, when you try to construct fermion operators in terms of, fermion field operators, you do it in terms of this BK and DK dagger, where DK dagger corresponds to negative energy states and BK corresponds to positive energy state. And both BK and DK, they basically annihilate the vacuum, which means that your vacuum is a filled negative energy states and empty positive energy state. Okay, so that's the construction of now annihilation operator. And from this, you can also construct a charge operator for the fermions, which is basically, in condensed matter, we call it the number operator, but in field theory, this is called the charge operator. And the way to construct it is this. And while doing this, there is an interesting thing that I would like you to note, that because you are doing this construction, you see there is a BK dagger BK out here, okay, which means that I can write it as BK dagger BK minus half, because of the, the commutation or anti-commutation relation of the fermions. And similarly, this DK dagger gives you a minus of DK dagger DK minus half. So you see that these factors of half basically hovers around. However, they cancel because of their contribution from the positive energy states and the negative energy states. Okay, so this symmetry between the positive and the negative energy state of the Dirac fermions that corresponding to every electron in the positive energy state, there is a positron or its antiparticle in the negative energy state. This symmetry essentially leads to this factor of half cancellation. Okay, and then you get a final answer, which is bk dagger bk minus dk dagger dk. That's your total charge. And we know that this must be an integer, okay, because both this number operators has integer eigenvalues. It just counts the number of fermions in a given mode, okay. So their difference must also be an integer. Note that this integer happened because all these factors of half got cancelled due to existence of paired energy states, okay, fermions and antifermions. Okay, is this part clear? Any questions here? Anything which is not particularly clear or anything? Okay, if everything is clear, let me now proceed to the more difficult sector, which is the soliton sector. So the next question they asked is that suppose I am not in the vacuum sector. Suppose I take the soliton sector for my Dirac fermions, okay? Sorry, the bosonic mode. What happens to my fermions? Well, now the fermions satisfy a much more complicated equation, which has this tan Hx sitting in the mass term, okay? And this needs to be solved. So it turns out that this equation can be exactly solved, and I'm not going to solve the entire thing for you. Although that solution was given by many people, including Brzozowski in the 70s, okay, in the context of Su Schrieffer Higgins soliton, which I'm going to come to in a moment. But really, these equations can be exactly solved for all energies. Okay. However, there is a special thing here. You see that if I consider this zero energy out here, okay, there is a solution for that which has weight only on either the psi2 fermion or the psi1 fermion, okay, depending on depending on convention of your choice of M. If M is positive, then it's only the psi1 fermion that contributes to this stuff, and the other fermion is zero. So how does this work? Just take this solution. Then you see that if M is positive, this is normalizable, okay? And because, you know, if you do this integral, you will find that it's a positive definite function. And it turns out that if M is greater than zero, this thing is an exponentially decaying function of some function of X. The point is that if I take this and substitute it here, you see that psi2 is zero. Okay, and so if E is zero, this equation is satisfied. The first equation is satisfied. And in the second equation, if E is zero, then I need to satisfy del x plus M tan Hx root by 2 acting on psi1 must be zero, which means that this is the solution of it. So this satisfies both the equation, and therefore what we find is in the soliton sector, apart from the standard positive and negative energy state, there is a zero energy state. And the interesting thing here, and this is probably the most important thing for us, is that there is only one such state. If you have M greater than zero, you can only have this eta naught. You cannot have a state where you have a zero out here, zero for the first component, and a finite number for the second component. That state, if you try to construct it, you are going to see that that state is not normalizable. Okay. So you cannot really have that. As a result, what happens is that now, instead of having this paired structure of all energies and its corresponding negative values, I suddenly have an unpaired zero energy mode. Okay. Now, this zero energy mode is localized because you can clearly see from the wave function that it's exponential minus of some number. So it's going to be localized. And the idea is that it's also its own charge conjugate. So if you take any Dirac electron and take its charge conjugation operator on it, you get the corresponding negative energy state from the positive energy. So fermions goes to, you know, antifermions and so on. But this state has no separate antiparticle corresponding to it. Okay, it's its own pair. So therefore, it's also its own charge conjugate. That's the important thing that I wanted to point out. So that now there are total 2n plus 1 state Okay, where n is of course infinity in this case, but soon we'll come to condensed matter systems where n is a finite but very large number. But the point is that instead of an even number of state, which was there in the previous problem, okay, here there is an odd number state, and that remaining one state is the zero energy state. You could also see that a state with zero energy is not going to work for a solution like this. That you can also check. Now the point is, now once we understand that you do have this zero energy state and that it's a single state, how do we construct it? My fermionic operator, annihilation operator. Of course, I am going to have some functions here now. Those are solution of this Dirac equation. But you can still construct this charge operator in terms of BK and DK dagger, just as we did for the fermions, except that now this eta kx, which I haven't specified, are more complicated function. But the important point is that apart from this, there is also a zero energy state sitting here, which is A, which is the annihilation operator of the zero energy state, times some eta naught. Okay. So since this state is at zero energy, it's degenerate corresponding to filling. So there are two degenerate states. One of them is called, sol, which is a short for solution, and the other one is sol hat. And the difference between them is that one of them is occupied with a zero energy mode. So there is a fermion sitting there, or that mode is occupied. However, the other thing is that that mode could be empty. Okay. So here, A acting on this state annihilates it, which is the empty state, and A dagger acting on the state gives you the occupied state. But the empty and the occupied state are both degenerate. Okay. And the reason is that it's at zero energy. Okay. So now let's construct the charge quantum number, which we did for the other, for the vacuum sector. Let's construct it for the soliton sector. Now for the soliton sector, you see that again, if I take this psi dagger psi, I get a half times A dagger A out here. This integral is just going to give you that. And now, because there is no pair corresponding to A, so there is no, so corresponding to every BK, you have a DK dagger, etc. But corresponding to A, you have nothing. So this factor of half doesn't cancel. Okay. So you see that now I have an integer plus and half integer out here, because A dagger A could be 0 or 1, which means that the number operator now has fractional eigenvalues. It's fractionalized to half, which means that Q sol, Q acting on this state, zero energy state, could be either minus half or plus half, depending on if the state is unoccupied or occupied. Okay. So there is this two degenerate ground state have different eigenvalues of number operators, and this is the first known example of fermion number fractionalization arising out of ground state degeneracy. Okay, and this degeneracy is because that you have a state at zero energy which has the same energy irrespective of whether it's occupied or empty. Now, of course, in field theory, where fermion numbers are not conserved, this can happen. But then one asks the question, what the hell are we talking about when it comes to condensed matter systems? Because in condensed matter, there is always this thing that you always have the fixed number of particles, because you have a chunk of solid and you have taken a fixed number of electrons out there, 10 to the power 23 or some such very large number. So you really cannot have half of them. Okay. So fine. So what people wanted to come out about is a finite size version of this Jacobian-Rabi solution out here. So imagine that you take this 1 plus 1 dimensional field theory and you put it on a lattice, okay, with the boundary condition, which is periodic. So it just tells you that the psi of L is psi of minus L, and you try to solve for this, and you do this numerically, for example. Then what you see, and I'm not going to get to the solution here, but the interesting thing is that then what you see is that you see that there is one there are two such fractional objects or zero energy state, not one. And one of the zero energy state is located at the origin, the other at the edge of the sample. They took a semi-infinite sample, okay, and then the Fermion number fractionalization is gone, because corresponding to the half coming from one zero energy state, you also have a half coming from the other zero energy state, okay. However, that's not the end of the story. The interesting thing is that there is no fractionalization of the total number. Therefore, the theory is compatible with integer number of electrons, as it must be. However, if you have local probes which can pick up fermionic density either at the edge or at the center, okay, then you are going to see this effect of this fractionalization, okay. This fact, so local probes can pick up fractionalization even if the system is not fractional in the whole sense, okay. So if you sum over all states in your sample, of course you are not going to find any fractionalization, because there is always an integer number of electrons. However, what this kind of solutions do is that they spatially split the peaks of a Fermion wave function into two different spatial locations. And if you can have a spatial probe, a probe which is localized in space, then you can still pick up the signature of this fractionalization. And this is a key concept in understanding fractionalization in condensed matter systems, because you really never ever have just a half fermion in a in a condensed matter system, but you can have a localized half fermion where the other half stays at some distance in some other part of the sample. So spatial separation of half modes is possible, and that's what you see in this kind of systems. And you see that this is nothing new in some sense. For topological insulators, we found that there are two Dirac fermions, Dirac theory, each of them localized at one given surface. Okay. So in the sense that you always have an even number of Dirac cones in any lattice theory, this is analogous to fractionalization, because it's half the number of allowed Dirac cones that you see on any given surface. But the total must be compatible with having an even number of them. Similarly here, the total number of electrons must be finite. However, you can see half of them at specific locations inside the sample. Okay. Also, the other point to remember is that in solid state system, these fractionalized Majorana fermions, and I'm going to come in a moment why we are calling it a Majorana fermion. They are not really fermions, and they are not fundamental particles. Okay. They do not appear as fundamental particles in the theory. They are emergent particles at fixed energy, and here it's zero energy. And there is a big difference. Okay. So for example, and this, as we will see, leads these Majorana states, and I'm going to call them Majorana modes for most of my talks. They may have exotic properties such as non-abelian statistics. So in the Jacobi, so when we do, and let me clarify this a little bit. So when we do this thing in one-dimensional condensed matter system, the analog of the bosonic sector with the Jacobi-Brevy theory comes from some density wave fluctuation in condensed matter, which I'm not going to get into the details of it, but that's what provides this tannage potential. Okay, so you do get a static potential coming from the bosonic sector, except that here it's like a local, it's like a spatial potential coming from the system itself. So it's some charge density wave or some spin density wave which develops in the system, and that's what provides this tannage potential. And that's essentially what leads to this fractional fermions. Okay. This will become absolutely clear when we discuss the superconducting part, but this is just the history part of it. Okay. So any questions?
So can I just ask one question?
Sure.
So in this case, there is no back action from the fermionic sector on the bosonic sector.
No, that is not usually considered.
And does it change the? Can that kill the fermion?
No.
Sorry, the Majorana mode.
No, it doesn't, because you see, the point is that in general, these are so people did study it considering the back reaction, and that comes in some kind of consistency condition of the on this fermions. But this solution that I am talking about, this Jackie-Brevy solution, or rather the solution given by Brzezowski in context of this one-dimensional charge density waves, the Su-Schrieffer-Higa soliton, so to speak, that solution takes into account the back reaction. It's an exact solution. Okay. I haven't shown you that because it's complicated, but the solution is exact.
So if another sort of dumb question, in the beginning when you considered the non-vacuum sector for the bosons and solved the Dirac part, so there the idea, the requirement for normalization is because now you have a potential. In the vacuum part, I can still have plane waves and have them non-normalized, but here you're requiring that your solutions should be.
Otherwise, it will exponentially grow. You see, and you cannot normalize them.
And does this? And you also said like mass positive and mass negative. Is there some meaning like in other condensed matter system can M become negative?
No. M is not really the mass.
Not a mass. Okay.
System. But the point is, it's some localization length.
I see.
But the whole point is that, let me show you this. So this quantity, because of the nature of this function, this quantity for x greater than this quantity is exponentially decaying only if m is greater than 0.
Okay. So that m is some length of that soliton or something.
That's right. It's a localization length essentially.
All right.
But the point is that if you take the other sign of m, you're going to see that it's not really, so you're going to get the other solution, which is 0 and then a to the power mc.
Okay.
Then that state becomes normalizable, but not this one. Overall, you are going to have only one, but which one depends on your choice of m.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay. So now, so fine. Any other questions? Okay, if not, let me go to the other part. So the next thing is that I want to show you that these fermions have essentially, so these Majorana modes essentially have vortices, essentially have non-abelian statistics. And for that, let me do something. So it was shown by Ivanov in 2003 that if you take a P-wave superconductor and you create a vortex within them, typically, in any superconductor, in the core of these vortices, it turns out that there are some fermionic excitations. Okay, and these are known as these solutions were first given by Károlyi, Dijan, and Matrikon, and they are known as Károlyi, Dijan, Matrikon fermions in the core of a superconductor. Now, for S-wave superconductor, it turns out that so if you take this vortex, you can think of them as being a harmonic oscillator-like potential. And what Károlyi, Dijan, Matrikon showed is that just like the harmonic oscillator potential, at least at low energies near the Fermi energy, the states have half times h bar omega naught kind of this. So there are some levels, okay, but those are half integer levels. However, in P-wave, it turns out, and I'm not going to get into the details of this. You can read this paper by Ivanov, which gives this which is a very nice paper actually. It turns out that instead of having half integer solution, you have integer solution, and particularly one zero mode. Okay, and this zero mode again turns out to be exactly similar to the zero modes that we just discussed, and it's a Majorana mode. Okay. It does so corresponding to so I'm not going to again get into the details of how that came in the core of these vortices, but just imagine that I have a vortex with a Majorana sitting at the core at zero energy. Okay, let's just take this. Now think of the exchange statistics of this Majorana fermion bosons or Majorana fermions. Let's say you would see that now this is a vortex. And this is my line of branch cut where you pick up a phase 2 pi as you circle the vortex. So I can think of crossing a branch cut, hypothetically, as I go in. Now, if I sort of exchange, if I take gamma 1, the first vortex, to the position of gamma 2 and gamma 2 to the position of gamma 1, you see only one of them crosses the branch cut. Okay, so essentially, and therefore, since it's a single branch cut that is being crossed, the Majorana fermion, being half of a fermion, picks up a phase pi. Okay, so this means, and this can be shown. Okay, and this means that the Majorana fermion out here goes to negative. So gamma 1 goes to minus gamma 2, and gamma 2 goes to gamma 1. So this is gamma 1 and gamma 2 are the annihilation operator for this Majorana fermions. Okay. Now, therefore, this operator can be encoded by this operation can be encoded by the braid operator. And what I need is an operation B12, where this B12 is going to take gamma 1 to minus gamma 2 and gamma 2 to minus plus gamma 1. And you can show that B12 can be represented by 1 over square root of 2 times 1 plus gamma 1 gamma 2. That's a standard. And then now comes the point. Now we have 3 of these fermions. Okay. So I first take gamma 1 to gamma 2 and then gamma 2 to gamma 3, something like that. And then first gamma 2 to gamma 3 and gamma 1 to gamma 2. Okay. So I interchange the order of this exchange. And then what one can show quite generally for many such fermions is that these operations where you first interchange I minus 1 and then I, and or where you change I to I plus 1 first, these operations do not really commute. And therefore, this tells you that the order of the exchange matters for these fermions. And therefore, these vortices or Majorana modes sitting at the center of these vortices must be non-abelian because exchanging them leads to the conclusion that the order in which you exchange them matters. Okay. So the point is that, and this can be shown for almost all Majorana modes, but it's difficult to sort of do thought experiments with, localized states where they are sitting at the edge of a sample. You don't really know how to move them around one another. However, here it's very easily done by moving in vortices, okay, which is much easier to picturize. So I just told you this to you in terms of vortices, but you can do this in terms of other things also. Okay, any questions? So here you really see the difference that, these are not fermions at all. These are some non-abelian modes which are emergent in low energy condensed matter systems. Okay, any questions? Okay, if not, let me now try to tell you some recent developments in trying to realize these Majorana fermions in superconducting platforms, and that would be the rest of this talk, okay, and particularly how we detect them. So the first proposal to this was given by Kitaev, and he said that, well, if I have a chain with this T with a hopping and a superconducting pair potential, which connects Ci and Ci plus 1 with some chemical potential, and if I am in the limit where this chemical potential goes to 0 and T is equal to delta, I can write the Hamiltonian of this entire chain in terms of real valued operators. So what do? I combine a fermion creation operator at site I with the annihilation operator at site, again at site I, and take 2 real combinations, gamma 1 and gamma 2, corresponding to this, okay? And then the Hamiltonian can be written in terms of these real operators, gamma I2 and gamma I plus 1, 1. And therefore, the ground state, which will correspond to the minimum value of this, you see, this would mean that you are simply going to pair a fermion with its right neighbor, okay, something like this. And therefore, there would be 2 unpaired modes at the end of the chain. And because the entire thing is described in terms of this gamma, these 2 are essentially, because if you could have taken these 2 ends and you paired them together, okay, then you take these 2 ends and you pair them together, you would get a single fermion. And therefore, these are half of such fermions, and so there is a Majorana mode at the end of each of this chain. Okay, So that was Kitaev's proposition. But let me now get into a real superconductor and see how these modes can actually come in this kind of system. As a brief introduction to superconductivity, well, we have done this before. So we all know that electron-phonon interaction gives rise to an effective attractive interaction between fermions at momentum k and minus k on top of a Fermi surface. And therefore, what happens is that the fermions can lower their energy by forming a bound pair, which is called a Cooper pair. And this was the first inkling to the superconducting problem, which is given by Leon Cooper. And then once one pair can form a bound state and lower energy, all the fermions at all edges of the superconductor, then they also want to do that. And therefore, the ground state itself becomes unstable. So the metallic state now becomes unstable to a new ground state, which is the superconducting ground state. And the crucial part is that this superconducting ground state near the Fermi energy, first of all, it's gapped. And the second is that all the electrons have a well-defined phase, which is called the phase of the superconductor. Okay. So the important part for us is that once we have this superconducting phase, if I try to have excitations around this superconducting phase, these excitations are linear combination of electrons and holes, and they are called Bogoliubov quasiparticles. They satisfy a Bogoliubov-Dijan equation, where the pairing between these electrons and holes comes from this so-called pair potential, which is also the amplitude of pairing of these Cooper pairs. Okay, so this is the point that I wanted to make. Now, let's talk a little bit about this pair potential, which is what distinguishes the superconductor from metals. Okay. Now, this pair potential is an expectation value. It's a mean field expectation potential that occurs due to pairing of the electrons. And it's an expectation value of two electron annihilation operators, psi at R1 and psi at R2. First of all, R1 and R2 cannot be the same. If that happens, you clearly annihilate the state because two fermions cannot be there at the same. So this pair potential is characterized by two coordinates, and I can write them in the language of center of mass coordinate, which is R1 plus R2 by 2, and the relative coordinate, which is R1 minus R2. Okay. And I can also write it, there is also a spin involved here. So because you have the two spins to be spin half for each fermion, the pair can be either a triplet or a singlet. For the rest of this thing, I'm going to talk only about singlet superconductors and not talk about the spin structure. Okay, so that is out. Now, of course, there are two spatial dependencies here. One of them is the center of mass coordinate. Now, this center of mass coordinate tells you that if your pair is situated in a spatial point R, let's say R0, if the center of the pair is situated in a spatial point R0, is the pair potential how different it is in comparison to when the the pair, the center of mass coordinate was at some other location, say some R0 prime. So essentially, this tells you about the variation of this pair potential in space within your sample. So if I indeed consider a translationally invariant system, then this mean field, this pairing potential is going to be independent of the center of mass coordinate R0. Okay, I think there is a chat. Is there a question? Oh, okay. It's not a question, so fine. Okay, so the point is that so if if basically if I have a delta, then and if I have translational invariance, then this delta doesn't depend on the center of mass coordinate. But the relative coordinate is somewhat different. Relative coordinate, the Fourier transform of this, and this is well known in the theory of superconductivity, the Fourier transform of this relative coordinate essentially tells you how this pair potential varies around the Fermi surface in momentum space. Okay, and that is used to classify the different types of pairing potential. And this also gives you the name of the superconductor, what you have heard, S wave, P wave, D wave, etc. And let me try to show you how. So, okay, so I'm going to call the relative coordinate the Fourier transform of this relative coordinate of function, which is g of kf. It only depends on the angle around the Fermi surface. So if I consider a spherical Fermi surface, this would just be the angle. Okay, and this gives you the variation around the Fermi surface. So the nature of this g of kf tells you about the nature of the pair potential. Now, SOF superconductivity, what you see in normal metals, for example, in copper or lead or whatever, that corresponds to this g of k being equal to 1. So the pair potential doesn't have any variation around the Fermi surface, so it's just like this. Okay. However, there could be other things. So for example, in cuprates, where you see this third figure, this g of k has a variation something like kx square minus ky square divided by kf square, where kx and ky are the x and the y component of the Fermi momentum. Okay, so this means that it varies according to cos 2 theta. Okay, so you clearly see that here I can designate this variation by an angle, and therefore I can describe this pair potential by calling its name in different angular momentum channels. So for example, if it's completely independent and I don't need an angle to describe it, it's L equal to 0, which means it's a standard SOF superconductor. Typically this e to the power IL theta or PLM cos theta is what these wave functions are. So here g of k is cos 2 theta, which means that you have a D wave because it's L equal to 2. Okay. Here, for example, in some kind of quasi one-dimensional organic materials, you have L equal to 1, which is kx over k. Okay. But the important point, which is going to be important for us, is that once you have this kind of variation around the Fermi surface, the pair potential can have change of sign as you go around the Fermi surface. And this is going to be very important for what we are going to discuss next. And also, there are nodes in the sense that when kx is equal to ky, that is around these diagonal lines out here, the 45 degrees line, the pair potential vanishes, which means that in the Fermi surface there, the gap vanishes. So you are going to have nodes in the gap of the pair potential. That's not always necessary. For example, here also you change sign from one Fermi surface to the other, but because of the open nature of this Fermi surface, you don't really have a node. Okay. So this is sort of how you get different kind of pair potentials for superconductors. Okay, and we are going to see that for a special type of superconductor where these wave functions indeed change sign, we are going to have some very interesting states localized at the edge of the sample called the mid-gap states, and that's the first thing that we want to do. So the history of this mid-gap state, it came from work of Shear and Hu in 1992. We also worked it for quasi and one-dimensional organic superconductor. But the statement is the following. So imagine that you have an edge in your sample, boundary, and if a quasi-particle, superconducting quasi-particle goes to the edge and it reflects back, okay, while going, it sees a pair potential which is characterized by the parallel momentum and the longitudinal momentum. Okay, and while going back, it sees the other way around. That longitudinal momentum actually changes sign. Okay, and if this change of sign leads to a change of phase of the pair potential phi k parallel seen by the quasi particle, then you have a mid-gap state whose dispersion depends on this phi k parallel. And if phi k parallel is pi, that is, if there is just a sign change of the pair potential, then energy is 0. Okay, and I'm going to show you how that exactly how this solution comes. Okay, also, if there is a boundary condition out here, you need to write down a solution where your wave function must vanish at the boundary. Okay, and therefore this different boundary condition can lead to additional state, and that's what these mid-gap states are. And because they come from the boundary condition, they are typically localized at the boundary. They decay as you go inside the bulk. Okay. So let me now try to show you the solution, which is not that difficult. Okay, so let me try to go back. Okay, so this is a very caricature kind of solution. So you see that when a quasi-particle goes and hits an edge, what I have is that there is a right moving quasi-particle, and after deflection, it becomes a left moving thing. So if I have a quantum state here which is localized, it's natural to guess that it must be due to superposition of opposite moving plane waves. Okay, oops, sorry. Plane waves, the quasi-particles which are moving in quantum mechanics are just like plane wave solutions. Okay. So what you need to do, and you also need to figure out a way in which the boundary condition is satisfied, that is at x equal to 0 right here, your wave function must vanish. Therefore, what one does is to, and also we know that if such a state exists, then it should decay within the bulk. So what one does is that one essentially writes down a decaying solution in the bulk. So this is x equal to 0 and this is x less than 0 on the left. So I have put on a kappa times x, an exponential decay. That's the simplest decay one can think of. And this kappa is greater than 0. And then you superpose wave functions with which are moving to the right and moving to the left, u plus v plus and u minus v minus. And these, of course, have opposite momenta, kfx and minus kfx, because they move in the opposite direction. And then you need to find out the ratio of this u plus v plus to be negative of the ratio of this u minus v minus. And the reason for that is that if that is the case, then at x equal to 0, your wave function would vanish. This is something you can see, that if this quantity is same as the minus part up to a minus sign, then clearly this thing becomes sine kfx, and it vanishes at x equal to 0. These u plus and v plus, these are wave functions of the BDG equation. And if I write down the Bogoliubov-Dijan equation, because I have a derivative in the x direction, I get back this kappa here. So this u plus by v plus from here can be written as delta plus by e plus I vh here. And here it's u minus v minus, which is given by that. And therefore, what happens? You can see that if delta plus is minus delta minus, then clearly I have a solution where E is equal to 0. That's very easy to see. On the other hand, if it's a S-wave superconductor, which doesn't change sign, and if delta plus is equal to delta minus, you are going to see that the only solution is E equal to delta and kappa equal to 0. Okay. And this is really straightforward to verify. And this means that change of sign of this pair potential leads to a bound state at the edge. Okay. So this, if I may, is the first step towards understanding edge states in a superconductor. Okay. Is this part clear? Any questions? Okay, so the point is that I have a zero energy state. Okay, so what do I do with this zero energy state? What does it give me? So the first thing is that if you look at the solution of this zero energy state, you are going to find that it has equal values for u naught and v naught up to a phase, which means that u naught is the amplitude of the electron part of the electrons in the superconductor, in this Bogoliubov-Dijan quasi-particle, and V naught is the whole part of it. So if they have the same amplitude, then clearly these states do not carry any net charge. Okay, so these are neutral states, which is good because all Majorana fermions are neutral by definition. Okay, because they are its own antiparticle, so the only charge it can have is 0. So the second part is that the wave function, one can show that if u naught is equal to v naught, the the field operators corresponding to this are such that if you take the complex conjugate of the field operator at k parallel and sigma, some spin, then you are going to find that it's exactly the annihilation operator provided you change k parallel to minus k parallel. Forget about sigma for now. I mean, I don't want to get into that. But the point is that if you shift k parallel to minus k parallel, you find that psi dagger is psi. Okay. So essentially, you don't really have two independent modes for k parallel and minus k parallel. You have only one mode because they are related. Okay. So this means that you have half the number of modes and there is a halving of the Brillouin zone. But these states are not Majorana fermions, just like the one in 1D, because of this distinction of having a k parallel. Because when you take the, any mode is not its own antiparticle. A mode at k parallel is the antiparticle of a mode at minus k parallel. So you still have half the number of modes in your Brillouin zone, but an individual particle is not fractionalized. It's not a Majorana fermion. However, the thing to note is that these states would be Majorana fermion if you have no in 1D where you don't have this k parallel, okay, and if you don't have the spin degrees of freedom, such as if you could have a spin polarized electron. Okay, so this was the first inkling as to how Majorana fermions can come in superconducting platforms. So, any questions regarding this?
Hello, sir.
Yeah, please.
So can you please tell us again about what happens to the one dimension? Like in 2 dimension, you said that fermions are not fractionalized. Then what happens if you go to 1 dimension?
Okay, so in 2 dimension, there is kx and ky, right? So suppose I have an edge which is at in the x direction. Then you still have a ky, which is a good quantum number. Okay, and what we are seeing is that the annihilation operator for minus ky is same as the creation operator as plus ky. Okay, so the field is not the particle is not its own antiparticle. The particle at ky is the same as antiparticle at minus ky. Okay, but in 1 dimension, of course, there is no ky, and therefore the particle must be at its own antiparticle if this kind of phenomenon happens.
Yes, sir. Yes,
okay. Sir. So you need to do away with this transverse momentum. That's the point. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, great. So now I'm now going to come up with an up with description of an experimental platform. And this was done in Shankar Darsharma's group in Maryland some years back. And this essentially tried to create an artificial platform for this Majorana fermions. So their setup is the following. Okay, it's a very simple setup. So what they did is that they took a simple nanowire and they put a superconductor on top of it. So in the previous lectures, what we saw is that when you bring a superconductor, or in those cases also a magnetic material, very close to a metallic system like a nanowire, you induce superconductivity in these materials. Okay, so that's the geometry out here. Okay, and then they have several gates. And these are not important. These are just kept in there so that you can basically make the chemical potential homogeneous throughout the sample. Okay, nanowires are usually very disordered materials, and you need to sort of treat them properly. So this is experimental details. Okay, so we don't need to get into the details of this. But the important part is that you have a nanowire and you have a superconductor. Now this nanowire is chosen such that it has very strong spin orbit coupling, and the spin orbit coupling couples the momentum kx along the nanowire to the spin direction y. Okay. And on top of this, one puts a magnetic field, and the direction of the magnetic field in spin space is called, the sigma z. That's the z direction in spin space. That's the direction of the magnetic field. Now let's look at what happens in this kind of systems. What happens is the following. So first, let's say that alpha and B, so both the spin orbit coupling and the magnetic field is 0, and I don't have any superconductor. So then clearly what do I have? I have two bands, okay, both parabolic dispersion. One correspond to spin up and the other correspond to spin down, and they are on top of each other, okay? Because they are on top of each other because of course, there is nothing to distinguish between up and down spins. Now if I put in a spin orbit coupling, okay, you see it's easy to see that now because there is a shift, wave function with eigenstate +1 of sigma y gets shifted to the right, and the wave function the band corresponding to sigma y equal to +1 gets shifted to the right, and the band corresponding to sigma y equal to -1 gets shifted to the left. Okay, and therefore the two bands split in the right and the left of each other, and so the right band contains spin pointing to the right, and the left band contains spin pointing to the left, which are eigenfunctions of sigma y corresponding to eigenvalues +1 and -1. Now let's put in a magnetic field. Okay, so the magnetic field, you can show that so now if you solve this problem with the magnetic field, you are going to see that it opens up a gap. Okay, just forget about this kx square minus mu for now. You see that this quantity is these two terms is just like a Dirac fermion. Remember our discussion of this topological insulators in Dirac fermion, but with a mass term, which is given by B. Okay, that's the diagonal term. So it's gapped. Okay, and also it rotates the spin because now we have sigma z and sigma y both. So and the spin gets rotated depending on the k value. Okay, so you have a picture like this. Okay? Now, if you make the magnetic field very strong, okay, the upper band essentially goes about the Fermi. Out of the two bands, the upper band essentially crosses the Fermi surface, and you have occupation only of the lower band. Now, if you put in a superconductor on top of that, you only create pairs in the lower band, okay, which is analogous to creating pairs only with one variety of spin. Okay, and therefore you induce a p wave superconductor in the band basis. Okay, because this band has only one type of spin, and therefore you induce this induce this superconductivity, and it's like a p wave superconductivity, and therefore a calculation similar to what we have shown you essentially tells you that this if you have a p wave superconductor at the edge of it, you are going to find a Majorana mode. Okay, and therefore here you expect a Majorana mode at the end of the sample right here. Okay, there will be two of them at the two ends of the nanowire, and that's what you expect.
So, Krishnendu, just a quick question regarding the nanowire itself. Yeah. So this basically there is not even a potential here, right? So it's almost like a free electron gas in 1D. So is this something that you have to do something to a simple metallic wire to make it into this? How does one make a nanowire in some sense?
No. So they can. Okay, so you take a metal and you cut very fine wire-like objects out of it.
Okay.
So they can. So I don't really know the experimental techniques for doing this.
Okay.
But they can do this. But the important part here, for our purpose, is to choose a material which has very strong spin orbit coupling. Okay, because otherwise this alpha term, this is not something you can manufacture. This is something which has to be there in your sample.
Right. Yeah. That part is very clear. So I was just wondering, like, if I wrote down the 1D metals Hamiltonian, I would have like some lattice potential in there, but there is no lattice potential in this Hamiltonian for the wire.
So the point is that there is lattice potential, of course. But the point is that this is the low energy description near the Fermi surface.
Okay.
So you have taken all your lattice and everything, and then you come up with some Fermi points.
Okay.
And you have some bands, of course, and this is metallic, so you have some Fermi points, and around the Fermi point, this is the dispersion.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, thanks.
And also there is this other thing. You could ask that how come I have superconductivity in one dimension, because I shouldn't have any mean field phases. The point is that this superconductivity is not intrinsic to the wire.
Okay.
It is basically
Proximity.
induced in the wire because of the presence of a 3D superconductor. So the usual Marvin-Wagner theorem doesn't hold here.
I see.
Okay, so that's another important point to sort of keep in mind.
Okay.
So induced superconductivity can occur in one dimension. You don't need Marvin-Wagner theorem for that. Okay. Fine. So now you see what. So what happens is that, okay. So I'm going to just skip through this, but the point is that if you do this whole problem, okay, so you can write down the energy dispersion and everything. That's simple. But the point is that one can show that if your magnetic field is larger than delta square plus mu square, where delta is the induced superconductivity and mu is the chemical potential, then you can have one of these p wave superconductor, and that's the regime where you would expect this Majorana modes. And okay, let me just show you an experiment which sees this. So here it's exactly that wire, and what they are doing is that they are measuring something which I'm going to come into. Okay, but let me just tell you that having a peak structure at 0 voltage essentially is a signature of this Majorana fermion, and I'm going to come to why this is the case in a moment. But you see that for small magnetic field, okay, so 0 millitesla to all the way to 500 millitesla out here. So for small magnetic field, you don't have this peak. So as you go on and cross in delta, which is roughly here, you find that this develops. Okay, so it's as if by changing the magnetic field, you are getting into this regime where you have this mode at the edge. I'm going to come back to this experiment in a moment, but this is just to show you that this is indeed experimentally feasible. Okay, so let me now get into okay, so this is one of the experimental platforms that people talked about. Okay, so then I can talk about the second experimental platform, which is not yet realized, but this was also another thing that was suggested. We have already seen this in the context of Dirac electrons, so I'm not going to sort of talk about it more. But here the point is that you again induce superconductivity, but now you do it at the surface of a topological insulator. And there is one spin per mode. So it's essentially again like a equal spin pairing, okay, that comes in. And this Majorana modes enter at the interface between a superconductor and a ferromagnet out here. Okay. But this is much more difficult to sort of realize because of issues with disorder, which I pointed out in the last class. So let's not get into this. I'm going to talk more about this platform in the rest of the talk. Okay. So now the question is, suppose I have these Majorana modes, how do I know what to detect? Okay. And what are the ways of detecting this Majorana fermions? So today I'm just going to talk about one detection scheme and then finish it there. And in the next class, I'm going to talk about another detection mode, which will be much more detailed in some sense, and more I would say a more robust signature of this Majorana fermion. But the first thing is to know whether these Majorana fermions are at all there at the edge. And how do you do it? You just see whether there is any signature or density of state of a fermion which is localized at the edge. To do this, people typically measure something called tunneling conductance. How does one do that? Well, it's very simple. Just think of taking two pieces of metal next to each other, separated by an insulating barrier. Now, if you put in a voltage around that, what happens? So putting a voltage, you displace one Fermi surface with respect to the other, which is greatly exaggerated here. You know, these Fermi surfaces are of the order of 10,000 Kelvin, and voltage is of the order of a few Kelvin. So you can imagine the amount of exaggeration that I have put in this diagram. So, but this is just for the eye. So essentially what you find is that an electron here sees that there are enough empty states in the second metal. So it can just move in out here, and that way current can go through the metal. In spite of having a barrier state, you can tunnel through. However, if you have a normal metal and a superconductor, typically what happens is that unless you put in a voltage which is larger than the superconducting gap out here. Remember that because of this Cooper pairing, the electrons around the Fermi energy forms a gap. And as long as your voltage is smaller than that of the gap, you don't have available states for the electrons from the normal metal to go there. And therefore, there is no current conduction. That's the expected thing. Well, there is something else. There is this issue about Andreev reflection, which I discussed in probably the very first or the second lecture, but let me not get into that. But the whole point is that if the insulating barrier in between is strong, then indeed you do not see any tunneling conductance, or you cannot push in current in the superconductor if your voltage is lower than that of the gap. So in technical jargon, what do they say? That subgap tunneling conductance, meaning subgap meaning when the voltage is lower than the gap, essentially vanishes. And the reason it vanishes is that there is no available density of state within the gap. But now this situation changes if you have a Majorana or any other mode at some fixed energy. There you can put in some electrons at that energy, okay, and therefore you can have a huge signal in this tunneling conductance at the center of the gap, which is at 0 voltage, okay, because all your energies are measured with respect to the Fermi energy in all convention, and that's the convention. So at 0 voltage, when you are right at the Fermi energy, that you can have a peak in your tunneling conductance because of the presence of mid-gap states. Because the states are there, you can put in electrons, and that is going to sort of give you this tunneling conductance. So 2 questions that one should get at this point, but let me just anyway clarify the questions. So the first one is that I told you that these mid-gap states are localized. Then you can ask, why the hell do they carry current? The answer to this is not so simple. It happens because it's a superconductor, and there is a mechanism called current conversion mechanism, whereas in a particle current that you push in these localized states can get converted into something called a condensate current. So that's some advanced stuff with superconductivity, transport in superconductivity. I'm not going to get into the details of that. But the point is that there is this mechanism called current conversion, which allows charge current to go through, even if the state in which you are pushing this current from the normal metal is localized. That's the first point. The second point is that I told you that these states are some weird Majorana modes, and they are not fermions. Then you can ask that, why the hell can I put in an electron in these modes? And the answer to this is that the wave function of these modes essentially has finite overlap with an electron wave function. That one can also show. And these 2 subtle things is what allows for this detection of Majorana modes by this tunneling conductance experiment. These are often overlooked, but these are very, very important when it comes to detection of Majorana modes. Okay. So any question regarding this part?
Hello, sir.
Yeah, please.
Sir, when you said that there is a finite overlap between electrons and Majorana modes, you mean the electron in the superconductors?
I mean the electron in the normal metal.
Like, sir, the normal metal that is in contact with the superconductor.
Yes.
But sir, I don't really get for that how you can put the electron there in the Majorana modes. Can you please again explain that?
Sorry, I don't really understand. So if there is an overlap between these 2 wave functions, okay, there would be an amplitude of having those having those particles in this mode, right? That's just the wave function overlap between the 2 states.
Right, sir. Right. Yes, sir.
There would be a matrix element. Okay, so that's what I'm saying.
Yes,
so let me clarify. So all I'm saying is that the structure of this Majorana mode is such that there is a finite matrix element between an electron wave function and a Majorana mode, so that our electron can be transferred from the electron states out here to the Majorana mode states on the superconductor. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So is there are there any other questions? Okay, if not, then let me show you this. So if I calculate this tunneling conductance, which one can do, okay, you find that if you have a SOF kind of superconductor, your tunneling conductance looks like this. Okay, it's a U-shaped curve, okay, which goes to 0. This T is the transmission function, which essentially tells you how strong the barrier potential is. Lower the T, the stronger the barrier potential. And you see that at strong barrier potential, the curve just looks like a U, which means that for the subgap tunneling conductance, it goes to 0. Okay. However, if it's a PUF superconductor with a Majorana mode sitting in out here, you see completely a different behavior, that you have a very sharp peak at the center of this this thing, okay, of your so at the center of your gap, which is at 0 energy. And if you make this T smaller and smaller, this peak becomes sharper and sharper. Okay, so this here the width of the peak is a bit exaggerated, but I mean, you know, okay. And then using this is what they detected. They just measured the tunneling conductance, and they really found this the presence of this peak at high magnetic field, which means they concluded that there is a development of there is a possibility of having a Majorana fermion out here. Okay, so this was the experiment did in the DELT group, where they showed the presence of mid-gap state. Okay. Now, there is some caveats out here. The first one is that, you know, this tunneling conductance predicts that the peak height that you have is going to be 2e square over h, whereas the DELT group experiment found a very small peak of 0.1 e square over h. And then there was this question, why is the mid-gap peak so small? There has been several possible explanation, interaction effects in one dimension or presence of disorder and stuff like that, which was put forth to explain this thing. And I don't really know if there is an explanation which is, you know, well accepted in the community. There may be, but at least till 2015 or so, when I was interested in this subject and was looking into it, there was no explanation of this. But that's a caveat. Okay. So this shows you that at least in terms of density of states, I do have some finite density of state which sits in out here. Now the question is, can you say that this is really a signature of the Majorana mode? The answer is yes and no. So the thing is that it certainly shows that there could be a Majorana mode in principle, because there is some states out there in the middle of the gap. However, this can also happen due to disorder or other extraneous effects, you know, which gives you a state at this energy. So it really doesn't distinguish Majorana modes from a non-Majorana possible disorder-induced mode, which can be there at the center of the gap. Okay. To do that, we need some kind of measurement which will depend on the superconducting property of these states. And this is something that we are going to discuss in the next class. So there is a signature of this Majorana mode in Josephson effect. Okay, and this is something that we are going to discuss in the next class. So I think I'm going to stop here now and take questions, because this is a good time to stop, because you know, this will take quite a bit of time, which I'm going to carry over in the next class. Okay, so any questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, let me just stop here, and we are going to meet next Tuesday, I guess, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, please.
Sir, can I ask a question about the previous class?
Yes, please.
So in previous class, when we were talking about the STM tip tunneling current,
yeah,
and you said that there is a azimuthal angle dependence there.
That's right.
And so that is particularly due to the spin quantization happen because of the topological insulator, right? Or you related to the electric field there in the x direction?
No. So, okay. So let me just try to discuss that fact. So what happens is that because you have a topological insulator, okay, what you have done is that because of the strong spin orbit coupling, you have specified your spin quantization direction, okay, and you have specified the relation of your spin quantization direction with the spatial direction. For example, if I have a xy plane, then when I write sigma dot k as the Hamiltonian, okay, that means I am identifying sigma x with kx, sigma y with ky, and so on. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, which means that I am specifying my z direction and the z direction in spin space to be the same.
Right. Yes, sir.
Right. So that's the first part. Now, if I put in a magnetic field or an STM tip or something like that, I cannot specify my z direction again. Okay. So,
Yes, sir.
so this is what leads to the azimuthal dependence. Okay, azimuthal angle dependence. And to see that azimuthal angle dependence, to probe that, you put in an electric field.
Right. That part, sir. Why do we need an electric field to probe that particular azimuthal angle dependence?
Otherwise, so that's because otherwise what happens is that unless you put in that electric field, your azimuthal direction, angle direction of pi and minus pi are the same. So there is a symmetry. So the contribution between these two essentially cancels each other, because you see, you really don't pick up a particular angle. What you pick up is the sum over all azimuthal angles, because you are measuring the net current. Okay. So
Right,
if there is a symmetry between pi and minus pi, then it turns out that when you sum over all angles, your azimuthal angle contribution vanishes. But if you have an electric field which breaks the symmetry, which distinguishes pi from minus pi because of its direction, okay, then you pick up a finite signature.
Right, sir. Right, sir. Now I get it.
So you need to break the azimuthal symmetry to have a integrated current.
Right, sir.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. If not, let us stop here, and we're going to meet on Tuesday, I guess.